Sego, it is Friday the 13th of April 2018. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people. We'll look back at our glorious and our grave history. A tough look at where we're at now and a look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, and simulcast and rebroadcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Tandanega. You can find our audio streaming at www.ltnradionet.com. And, of course, we are Facebook live streaming. We do this with every show here, and my shows in New York as well. I am John Kane, the show's host and producer, and I want to thank you for joining me. Look, I do have a show planned, but I do have to mention, if in case you are living in a cave someplace and are missing every other internet feed and everything else, Donald Trump has launched airstrikes on Syria, from what I understand. Not a whole lot I can do about it from here, but no real surprise either. But the only message that I'll add here is I still think this is a gesture. You know, I know a lot of people are saying, what has he done? Is he going to launch World War III? I'm sure he has already warned his Russian counterparts that he was coming in such a way as not to piss off his pal, Vladimir. So I don't know. I think it's a token gesture. The last time he did this, he bombed airfields that were operational within a day or two. So this is, an old man flexing very weak muscles. And, that's my sense of it. But, I don't want to downplay the idea of dropping bombs on people, especially bombing cities like Damascus and that kind of stuff. It's a terrible thing, but it's the world that we live in, and it's that's what you get with people in power like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, Assad, and so many other Netanyahu, all these other people who seem to revel in this notion of violence. I saw something on Facebook also, and I have to mention it. I saw posts of people setting up in elevated places near Gaza, Israeli citizens setting up so they could view the bombing of the Israeli military bombing unarmed Palestinians, and I couldn't help but liken it to the hysteria associated with lynching. Where people get something, get some sort of thrill out of watching people being killed, or going back to the mass execution at Mankato, Minnesota, when the white people of Mankato, Minnesota, came out the day after Christmas to watch a hanging, the likes of which the United States has never done, at least not through a trial, although it was a sham of a trial, the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. There were crowds of people with their children and their wives and their families out there to watch 38 Dakota being hung by the neck. Look, I don't know what it is about mankind and the way that I don't know. I guess the human behavior, but it's pretty disturbing nonetheless. So anyway, all right, let me get back. Let me get right into it. For me, the news that I think is something that I want to talk about is the news that broke with the Seneca Nation suing the governor and the comptroller and the attorney general, state attorney general, and different ones over the thruway. And there's been a lot of questions raised. In fact, I got a few calls from WBN News and a few others asking what my thoughts were on the subject. And and part of the question is like, why now? What happened that the Seneca Nation feels like they've got to sue over the thruway? I mean, this thing has existed since 1954 and that kind of stuff. And the messaging that came out of the Seneca Nation, not just the press conference where Todd Gates was speaking, but even some of the stuff that was in the news and some of the prepared statements, the messaging wasn't good. And and again, I'm not trying to criticize the strategy here. I just don't think the Seneca Nation was that effective at putting things in their proper perspective. And so I'm going to offer my thoughts. I'm not speaking for the Seneca Nation, and I'm not trying to outdo the Seneca Nation. But I think for people who are wondering, what is this all about? What does it mean? Where is it coming from? I'd like to offer my thoughts on it, and people can pick at it. They can agree with me or disagree with me, and perhaps as a result of the conversation that I'm trying to initiate here, there will be more commentary that comes out of Seneca leadership, and perhaps the people that Seneca leadership is suing in this thing to I guess illuminate just what the scenario is. And so let me kind of recap. In 1954, the state had pressured to the point of almost, you could call it extortion, I guess, had pressured the Seneca Nation to yield an easement on what would be the land that the thruway was built upon. Almost somewhere around 300 acres. They paid him some nominal fee, like $70,000, and then they bragged about it. By the way, and this is documented. There were folks from the state who boasted about how little they had to give the Senecas for this thing. Now, the Seneca leadership at the time, again, 1954. You have to consider the time and the position that Seneca leadership was in. They were all at the same time were that the state was trying to squeeze them for this thruway property. This was the beginning of what would ultimately be the Kinzua Dam, where the Senecas would be cheated and screwed out of tens of thousands of acres, or 10,000 acres, not just several hundred acres. So the federal government was doing that down in the southern tier on the Allegheny territory, and up here in Cattaraugus, you had the state trying to squeeze them for this thruway property. And look, there was, when I say threatened or extorted, there were threats not only associated with take the money they were offering, damn it, or we'll terminate you. And for those who don't know what termination means, the state wasn't in a position to do it, but if they had the ear of the federal government, they certainly could have said, well, we're not going to recognize the Seneca Nation exists anymore. We're going to create what some people call the paper genocide, I guess. We're going to write you off. We'll seize whatever land we want to seize, and we'll take it either through eminent domain or just seize it outright. And that's what the Senecas were faced with. And again, keep in mind, there wasn't a great I guess a great deal of resistance that was being offered up on from Native people. We hadn't gone through the civil rights issue eras with with Black people rising up. The sovereignty movements of the 70s hadn't occurred yet. So the Senecas were clearly in a spot where they had to take the threats from New York State and or the federal government very seriously. But here's the thing: even though the state was making these threats and was trying to squeeze the Senecas, they didn't collaborate with the federal government, and that's part of the foundation of what the Seneca argument is here, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But I mean, I think it's important that people realize just what the thruway is. It is a commercial enterprise. It is a money-making enterprise. It is a revenue-generating enterprise for the state of New York. And not only does it generate revenue for the state of New York, it facilitates commerce for the state of New York. And in fact, I would argue it facilitates commerce for other states, interstate commerce, because it is, especially where it crosses through Seneca land, it's connecting Western New York and all points east to all points west via this interstate. So it is a significant highway where the state pressured the Senecas to yield this property as an easement. Now, keep in mind, I want to be clear, the land that the thruway on is still Seneca land, and there's no denying that. There's no dispute there. And it's Seneca land. And I think sometimes it's easy to forget that Seneca land is not state land. It's not part of a county. It's not part of a town. And arguably, it's not part of the United States. I mean, and I say arguably, but I don't think there's much of an argument there, especially since the federal government used language like in Canandaigua that said the United States recognized the land as the Senecas, and the United States would never claim the same. So if you use the language from the federal government, it is clear that this land is not part of New York State, and it is not part of the federal government. So But regardless, the occupation and the control and the use of that land certainly was confiscated by the state through a process that was anything but fair and equitable. And it certainly didn't use language like free, prior, and informed consent that is supposed to be the international norm via the United Nations today. It didn't involve any of that. It was backroom dealing, and even when the Seneca said, "Well, if it's going to be a toll road, we'd like to collect a portion of the tolls," and they said, "No, we can't do that." And the Senecas just kind of had to accept that argument. Now the thing is, even though the Thruway was designed to be a toll road, it was never designed to be a toll road forever. I mean, it wasn't supposed to be a toll road for all of eternity. But yeah, the money starts flowing, and you never want to turn that spigot off, and so that's what it's become. A number of years ago, or years back, the Seneca Nation said, "You know what? This thing is not legal, and we're going to start assessing a toll to the state for the cars that travel on there." And based on the assessment that the Seneca Nation has performed, and car counting and that kind of stuff, it's somewhere between $600-700 million that the state needs to return to the Senecas from their portion of Thruway proceeds collected by those vehicles passing. They have not suggested or even acknowledged the bills that the Senecas have sent, and frankly, that's part of the reason that the Senecas have raised this issue again. More information on the Thruway. It's important that people realize it is a poorly maintained road. And the worst section of this road is the section on Seneca territory, and it has been. I mean, in fact, it was so bad. Not only was the Thruway itself so bad, but the overpasses were so bad that the governor actually had to be scolded by the president of the United States because he was trying to misdirect monies that were appropriated specifically for some of that highway repair, but because he was kind of pissed off at the current president at the time. I think it was Robert Porter. He was refusing to fix the bridges and the roadways that federal transportation dollars were coming in on. And finally, he got scolded and said, "Look, you don't get to decide where this money gets used," and so he had to ultimately fix those bridges. And that's why now the bridges that cross the Thruway have some Seneca design on it, and there was some upgrades. And I think the Seneca Nation probably did some things to add their own enhancements to the bridges. But the condition of the highway, and I got to tell you, it was so bad. Let me back up a little bit. It was so bad that there were chunks of flaked off pieces of steel or iron falling onto the Thruway, and chunks of concrete falling onto the Thruway from those bridges. They were doing these temporary repairs where they were jamming in treated lumber in sections of these bridges to keep them level and that kind of. I mean, it was just absurd. And Matt, who sits in with us sometimes, was actually going down to talk about some of these. He actually went down and looked at the bridges and was just amazed at what he saw. So anyway, and I think he was involved in the demolition of the old bridges before they built the new ones, and that demolition went pretty easy, from what I understand. It didn't take much to take them out of there. So I think it's important people realize just how poorly maintained, and not just here. If you recall, a few years ago, there was like a 100-foot or a couple of 100-foot stretch of Interstate 86 down in Allegheny that just separated and fell down the bank. I mean, it just, a whole lane I think it was on the westbound lane of Interstate 86 as you head out of Salamanca, just fell. I mean, it just collapsed. I mean, so that's how bad the state has been in addressing these issues. And of course, we have our own issues. I mean, I've posted some pictures about my concern about the road that leads up to the area of Indian Hill that I live on, that it's not part of that's not on the territory, but it's just before you get onto the Cattaraugus territory. And realize that's not a state issue, but really the state should step up and they should come up with a fix for these roads. But anyway, let me get back to the Thruway. So this is what you have happening in 1954. This pressure for the Senecas to yield this easement for the thruway. Now, the Senecas did raise the issue, and in fact, a federal judge acknowledged back in, and I don't want to get the dates mixed up, but it might have been in the 90s or anyway, back away a while ago, that the state did not follow proper procedures and certainly did violate federal law by not getting federal approval for the easement that they had entered into. Now, I gotta say, I'm not crazy about how some of this was characterized in some of the statements that I saw. Some of what I was seeing on the news made it sound like the Senecas were saying that the federal government has an obligation to protect us and that kind of stuff. And I don't want to paraphrase or put words in anybody's mouth. I think it's, I'm one that wants to be cautious on how you characterize the relationship between the federal government and the state government, because keep in mind, the federal government wasn't exactly being responsible at the time either. They were screwing the Senecas out of 10,000 acres over the Kinzua Dam issue. So this wasn't just that the federal government didn't fulfill its trust responsibility to the Senecas. There was almost no trust responsibility that the federal government was providing anybody, any place. But now that we're where we're at, and you look back and you realize that those approvals didn't happen, I think the Senecas have grounds. But there's more than just the violation of federal law at stake here. There's clearly a problem with the process that was employed back in back in the 1950s, and the incredible amount of revenue that the state has generated from not just the thruway, but the state has generated from access through Seneca territory. And of course, there's other access through Seneca territory. There's rail that goes through. There's pipelines that go through. There's power lines that go through. But that thruway is where everybody gets to cut across Seneca land. And keep in mind, these highways do not do anything for local economies. I mean, and these studies have been out for years on the interstate system, how much they bypass towns and they kill local economies. Because at a time when people used to be able to drive through a town and stop in and shop or eat or whatever else, now people can travel, 60, 70, 80 miles an hour on an interstate and just whiz by these little towns. So rather than, and when you look at the Seneca territory and the alternative routes that exist from the thruway, which would be U.S. Route 5 or U.S. Route 20, both those go right through Seneca territory. And in fact, Senecas have many stores and businesses, including the Seneca Nation has a gas station, convenience store, and a major gaming operation in their bingo hall right along that route. The thruway eliminates people from even seeing those things. They just drive right by. So the thruway was not good for our economy. It was only good for the state and for the state economy and frankly, interstate commerce. And when you consider what the thruway did to not, and frankly, it wasn't just us. I mean, little towns like Angola and Silver Creek and Irving, they got hurt by this thing too. So you put that into context with what the way the state has treated the Senecas and other natives on our commerce, constantly at battle. I mean, think about how many times we fought the state since 1954 over tax issues, over tobacco revenue, over fuel revenue, or taxation, tobacco taxation, over supply, over our own commerce, over gaming. I mean, and now we're talking about fighting not just the state, but even the federal government. I mean, I think about agents coming in because of us selling pull tabs back in the day. I mean, when I think about the fights that we have had with the state and the federal government over us trying to develop an economy ourselves, while they have unencumbered, unfettered access to cross our territories for their own benefit. I mean, even now, I've talked about Eric White's case, and I don't mean to just shine the light specifically on Eric, but when you consider a Seneca licensed wholesaler delivering a native product to a native territory, and he's a Seneca licensed wholesaler, and he's Seneca. His driver was Seneca. To have the state interfere with that commercial exchange, interfere with that transaction, and then fine him over $1 million is just absurd. Not only did they seize the product, but then he issues a fine, for conducting native to native commerce. And this comes in the face of two state senators, and I've talked about this before, who've questioned whether the state has the authority to interfere with native to native trade anyway. So we have that, and of course we also have the ongoing battle with the state over gaming revenue, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the second half of the show, because the Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul weighed in on this, and apparently Niagara Falls, and I alluded to this last show. Niagara Falls actually passed through their city council plans for how they will use gaming revenue, and they say hopefully, they say when the revenue returns, and they really mean if, because most of them I think know it's not coming, but they actually passed a spending plan for money that's never going to come. I mean, like they had nothing better to do, I guess. So we'll talk about that. But again, the squeeze that's coming from the state on gaming revenue, even as they have cannibalized the gaming market, is just another example of the interference that we have from the state on our own economies, and on any kind of economic development that we do. And so on one hand, we have the state that is constantly at odds with us as we try to develop economically, while again they have absolute, complete, unfettered access to cross through Seneca land, and actually charge others who cross through Seneca land, to make a bunch of money. I mean, it is really kind of an absurd proposition. So what's happened here is the Seneca Nation, and I think part of the reason it didn't happen sooner was because of the gaming dispute. And as I look at this thing, I think they were holding back on this until the gaming thing would have kind of, been, in the rearview mirror. Apparently that's never going to get put in the rearview mirror, because the state and the governor and the lieutenant governor and these mayors around here are still holding out hope against hope that somehow they're going to be able to squeeze the Senecas for money they have no claim to. But so I think that's part of the reason I think the Seneca Nation held back on this thing. But they've been developing a legal strategy to hold to bring a suit against New York State, to bring a suit against the Thruway, to basically stop them from doing what they've been doing for 60 years, which is again extorting money off of people traveling through Seneca territory, and in fact creating the mechanism for people to cross through Seneca territory without even knowing it for the most part. So there's a couple of things going on. There's obviously some revenue from tolls that could be entered into the mix, that the Senecas have been sending bills to the state. But there's also other things going forward. And, part of the thing, the Seneca Nation has clearly been looking at the possibility of either establishing service areas so they could finally begin to enjoy some of the benefit of the Thruway being there. I mean, it serves no benefit to us. I mean, people think that, well, yeah, shut that Thruway down. How would they like that? We don't travel the Thruway for the most part. We can get to Buffalo or Erie without getting on the Thruway, and certainly we don't have to travel the section that's on that's on Seneca land to do that. So the Senecas have been looking at a plan for a while on how they could finally see some benefit to the Thruway being there. And I think to lay the groundwork for that, they had to do this, and of course they did initiate a legal action before, and this is built on premise a little bit different. But there's also something else that I think is worth mentioning in all of this, and that is again a new resolution that the Seneca Nation has passed, which was a resolution about the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and basically the title is to affirm the rights recognized in the UN, in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People as the minimum standards Indigenous peoples are entitled to, and for the Seneca Nation to assert these standards and their own higher standards as the foundation for its government-to-government relationships. So, if the Seneca Nation is saying, look, we're taking not just a whole new look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and what it means in terms of international law, we're saying that this is now going to be the foundation for how we deal with the state and the federal government. No longer is the state just going to say, "Oh, we have state law," or is the federal government going to say we have federal law? No, Seneca Nation is saying you can have those laws, but we have an international document that is intended to hold you guys accountable. It isn't about granting us rights. It's saying that you have to recognize a minimum standards of rights that indigenous peoples have. And as I go through this thing, especially as it relates to the Thruway, I'm looking at article after article after article where there's some mention of something that this Thruway has represented. And Article 8 is an article about condemning forced assimilation. Obviously, the state used threats, intimidation, and force to make that Thruway happen. So, and that's, I mean, it just simply says the indigenous people and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation. Well, there you go. That's one example. Article 10, indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. And no relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement or on just and fair composition where possible, with the options there to return that land. So Article 10 is saying you can't forcibly remove people. And as you go through, you go to Article 11, Section 2, it talks about that the states shall provide redress, a mechanism to resolve and to make payments or restitution or return lands when such a thing does occur. That's Article 11. Article 20. I just go through this article by article. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and develop their own political, economic, and social systems or institutions, and to be secure in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence, and to engage freely in all their traditional and other economic activities. Indigenous peoples deprived of their means of subsistence are entitled to just and fair redress. Again, that's another redress article. Again, and this is international law. So as the Seneca Nation brings its case against the state on this thing, I hope that they do what their new resolution says they're going to do and put this stuff out there. I don't care if a judge rejects it or not. I think they should put it out there. Article 21 is another one. It talks about the right to that we have the right to improve economically, and we have the right to redress if our economies have been destroyed or altered. Article 25 is that right for us to maintain our spiritual relationship to the land and the territory and the resources, and again to expect redress in the event that is violated. Article 28, indigenous peoples, and this one couldn't be more clear. Indigenous peoples have the right. Okay, let me go back. Article 26. Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, and otherwise used and acquired. I mean, it couldn't be any more clear when you look at Article 26. It says we have the right to our lands, and that any encroachment of that lands has to be properly addressed through a proper compensation or the means for that land to be returned or replaced by other lands or something along those lines. I mean, it couldn't be any more clear. Again, Article 28 talks about indigenous people have the right to redress by means that can include restitution or the replacement of land or the return of land. Article 29 talks about our right to conservation and protection of our lands and the environments that affects our lands. So all of these things, I mean, I got to tell you, that Thruway, there are trucks carrying stuff that the Seneca Nation knows absolutely nothing about. Say the same thing about rail. When I think about the rail and what is being transported on that rail and on the Thruway, the Seneca Nation has no idea what's being transported there. I mean, that section of Thruway crosses over the Cattaraugus Creek, which dumps into Lake Erie. So all of the Seneca Nation's lake frontage is endangered by the Thruway and by the rail that runs parallel to the Thruway. I mean, these are the things that international law is saying that the Senecas have a right to raise issues related to this Thruway. So again, I think when people ask that question, why now? Well, I'll tell you, they just adopted this resolution just now, and I think they were trying to perhaps a little of it settle down from the fight with the state over the gaming revenue. but that doesn't ever seem to go away either. So, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we come back. We're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break, and we'll come back, and I'll weigh in a little bit on what's happening in Niagara Falls and what some of the comments were from Kathy Hochul, the New York State Lieutenant Governor, speaking on behalf of Andrew Cuomo, the state's governor. So we'll talk about that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. I'll be right back.
Columbus lives. Told Isabella that the world was round. She thought he'd flipped his lid. He bugged the queen so much she finally said, okay, I'll give you 3 ships and some men. Said I'll find a brand new route to India. Queen, I soon be home again. In 1492, who found who? 1492, who found? Welcome all your tired and weary travelers. And old Chris gave out new names. But this ain't India, we are not Indians. To this day it's still the same. 1492, who found who? 1492.
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. I want to thank my sponsors who enable me to do this. It's funny because we used to be on commercial radio, and and there was probably a different and certainly a wider audience and a more localized audience because we were on commercial radio back in the day, and I needed significant support to do that because it was expensive. I was paying over $30,000 a year just for the airtime. We built a studio and have gone primarily here on the internet. And although I do have some folks that I'll mention here in a minute that help carry the show, but even doing what we do here including doing the show that I do in New York, it requires a certain level of support, and I appreciate those who do that. So I want to give thanks to my sponsors, Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises. I want to thank Legacy 420 for their support of the program, and individuals who, from time to time, drop a card in the mail or a letter or a postcard or something and slip a check in there to help us out. So guys like Ed Schindler, Cynthia Trice, Neville Spring. I want to thank all of you who continue to support the program. But as I said, I also need to thank all of you who have supported the program in the past. And, I hope that some of you will come back again someday. But we wouldn't be entering our 8th year now if I didn't have so many of you that were buying ads and doing, on-air sponsorship and that kind of stuff back when I was on commercial radio. So I thank all of you for having been there and frankly getting us to a spot there where we could put together our own studio. So I thank all of you for joining the fight and doing your part. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. I want to thank CKWE, Mohawk Radio in Tandanega for simulcast and rebroadcast of our show. I want to thank Netroots Radio and Real People's Media and Indigenous Resistance Radio for carrying Let's Talk Native on their networks. And of course, I want to thank all of you who share the show. And my wife is one of the ones who shares the Facebook live stream on many of the other Facebook groups. Others are doing the same, and I appreciate it. My good friend Donna Fan Boyle and Kathy Mays Vaughn and Toby Sid, John, and different ones who are also sharing not just the Facebook live stream, but those of you who are sharing the SoundCloud audio that I post afterwards, or usually the day after I post the YouTube video of the show, which is actually probably the best video experience because you don't have to deal with some of the. Sometimes we lose a little bit of the video stream because of internet issues or weather or whatever else. But you're going to see a higher quality video of the show when you check it out on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. So I thank all of you who share the show in whatever form that you share it, and I think the conversation that I try to have here is a conversation that I hope continues with you and with your family and your home and in your community. And of course, when I'm talking about here with this latest thing with the Seneca Nation filing suit against the Thruway, I think it is important that that a line be drawn in the sand. And regardless of what happens with the suit, I think the Seneca Nation has to stand strong, and I think they have to raise their issues at the international level with the it's the permanent forum of the United Nations is happening this week. Not that you're going to get redress out of the United Nations, but the whole idea is to use the pressure from the international community to get proper redress. Now, granted, any loss of land there's usually never a good fix for that. And any loss of land that gets bulldozed and manipulated and turned into something else like a thruway or a railway or whatever else, these are things you can't replace that land. But there are certain things that can happen with the thruway that could not only be a job creator and an economy creator for the Seneca Nation, but also to be something that does more for the regional economy, the local economy beyond the Seneca territories. We have lots of non-native employees here on our territories, not just in the gaming industry, but here in our private sector and other nation enterprises. So, the Seneca Nation is one of the bright spots in terms of employment and economic development. But having said that, I do have to address, again, the gaming news. Like I said, I heard something on the radio today and saw something in the paper and on the news a few times over the last couple of days. Niagara Falls, their city council passed a plan for gaming revenue that's not coming. I mean, which is kind of absurd, but it's like they keep putting it out there so they can keep the drumbeat, so to speak. Now, Kathy Hochul, who's the lieutenant governor, she weighed in, and she's kind of flippant in the way that she weighed in. She weighed in. She goes, "I just wish the Senecas would just pay what they're supposed to pay. They should just fulfill their obligation. They have an obligation to pay for the exclusivity that the state has given them." And then she goes on to say that they've made an incredible amount. They make an incredible amount of money off of that exclusivity. Well, Kathy, let's be honest here. The Seneca Nation, their gaming enterprises, even with expansion, and there has been expansion. There's been additional gaming floor. They've expanded down in Buffalo Creek. They've lost $100 million worth of market share. And who the hell do you think they lost that to? They lost it to the state. The state has not only did they turn their failing horse racetracks into little casinos, strip mall casinos, if you will, or whatever you want to call them, but these little slot parlors. And they did, and there's three of them right within the so-called exclusivity zone. But then they pass a referendum to build casinos, and the one casino that has been in the news so much, this Del Lago Casino out near Rochester, located between the Oneida Casino and the Seneca casinos, it is so clear that casino was built with the intention of taking the market share away from Oneida and Seneca. There's no question about that. In fact, their failure is that they haven't been able to take enough. They've taken plenty, along with the other states' facilities, but they clearly didn't come in to build a gaming market. I mean, because the argument was, and we've heard this from, I got into an argument with Steve Pigeon on Channel 2 over this. I was, you put a bunch of casinos together and you expand the gaming market. This isn't Atlantic City, which is not a good example, but it certainly isn't Vegas. This is New York. There's not exactly a tourist industry. The only gaming facility that actually does tap into a tourist market is the Senecas in Niagara Falls. It's the only one that is getting Canadian clientele and people who are coming there to see the falls. It's the only place, it's the only gaming facility that essentially is creating additional revenue from outside of the state. It's really the only one. The rest of them are relying completely on local market, and frankly, even the one in Niagara Falls, only about 25 or 30% of its clientele is from out of the region. 70% of it are locals. Because New York State is not look. They brag all kinds of things about people that go to the Allegheny State Park and people that go to ski country and people that go to the city of Buffalo because they want to brag that it's on this big upswing. It isn't on that big an upswing. And certainly Niagara Falls, in spite of its grand history and that kind of stuff, it is not bringing in the tourist revenue that it once was, and most of it goes straight to the falls. I mean, even the city of Niagara Falls doesn't benefit from the fact that they've got one of the seven wonders of the world in their backyard because, and frankly, the state gets more of that money than the city does. So when you look at this whole thing, the state has failed to build a tourist industry any place in the state that has benefited anything more than what the state holds, like parks and that kind of stuff themselves. They haven't done anything that takes any of that tourist revenue and puts it into any community. And they certainly, for the $1.5 billion that the Seneca Nation has given up to the state has done almost nothing to enhance the gaming industry. They have participated nil in the expansion of that market. So when Del Lago and Rivers Casino out in Schenectady, when they throw their doors open, they're opening up their doors hoping they can grab some of the gaming market that already exists because they aren't building a market themselves. And they're not only just trying to grab gaming market, they're trying to grab whatever entertainment dollars the locals would spend, whether it's at a restaurant or at a movie theater or at perhaps a local theater house or concert venue, nightclub. That's what these casinos are grabbing all that revenue from. And you know what? The Seneca casinos are doing the same thing. But the difference is the Seneca casinos are a different animal because the Seneca Nation isn't relying on Senecas to fund to be their clientele. They said they have a strategy that says, okay, we're going to try to pull money in from outside of Seneca territory so we can fund our nation. That's not what the state's doing. The state's relying totally on, it's almost like a backhanded tax. They're essentially fleecing their own people, for, and not just for themselves, but for these gaming operators. The other thing that has to be realized is that the Seneca Nation is not a for-profit gaming company. It is a nation. It is an organization that takes all of its proceeds and puts it back into its people. Spend all that money right back into the region. It's not a Malaysian gaming company or some rich guy from Rochester. No, this is a governmental entity. So, and my point is that 100% of the proceeds that go into that the Seneca Gaming generates is taxed. It's taxed essentially, and I don't want to say, and that's a bad word, but it is all that revenue goes into the Seneca Nation. It doesn't go into the pockets of a few gaming moguls. So yeah, so when Kathy Hochul is literally suggesting that the Senecas are still enjoying this incredible revenue stream from the exclusivity that the state has provided, that's a load of crap. For one thing, the state began violating that exclusivity from day one, and the numbers that are coming out on Del Lago state very, very clearly that there is no exclusivity. There is no market that the state has been able to protect for anybody, least of all the Seneca Nation. Seneca's lost $100 million worth of market share. $100 million worth of market share. And so Kathy Hochul's going to go on the news and say, the Senecas are making all this money for what we gave them. You know what? You didn't give the Senecas crap. And so the suggestion that somehow the Senecas owe this money just in general is just so wrong. But of course, the bottom line is It expired. It was a 14-year deal. That's it. The thing came to an end. It should have ended years ago. It should have ended when the Senecas put a hold on payments back in 2009 and settled it in 2013. It should have ended then. And the state is lucky it didn't go all the way through arbitration, because any set of judges looking at this thing would have said, well, the state isn't providing something of value to the Senecas. Certainly not something that could be evaluated at the rate that the Senecas are paying them. $1.5 billion went to the state. And all of that money that went to Niagara Falls was squandered. Now they want to put together a plan for what they're going to spend for spending gaming revenue. Yeah, that might have been a better idea if you'd have done that before. I mean, so anyway, I have to weigh in it because it is in the news, and again, when I hear the arrogance that is expressed by the governor, or in this case the lieutenant governor, I mean, it really is quite remarkable. Look, I realize that there's other news happening today, and again, as I mentioned at the top of the show, the violence in this world is just one of those things that as a people who are always stereotypically labeled as warriors, but in reality, we're people that created specific mechanisms for attaining and maintaining peace. It is really frustrating to watch this, but this isn't anything new. And, I talk about this all the time, the mischaracterization of history. Donald Trump is a moron, and I don't pull any punches about my view of him. Now, with all the struggles that he's having legally with the FBI, who is also another agency that I'm not a big fan of, considering what they've done to Indian country over the years. It's kind of, for me, it's almost entertainment to watch these guys wrestle with each other. But it's not very entertaining when I consider the fact that you have a country that's somebody using chemical weapons on people, whoever it is, whether it's Assad or whether it's the rebels. The fact that there are countries that develop these kinds of weapons and then are prepared to use them against women and children is just incredible. But make no mistake about it, there will be innocent lives lost anytime you open up an aerial campaign like the likes of which that Trump is doing, and there will be repercussions as a result of it. And of course, you know what else there will be? There'll be lots of money made on this thing. The people who produce Tomahawk weapons are going to get new orders. Tomahawk missiles, I'm sorry, are going to get new orders, and there's a tech industry and an arms industry that's just foaming at the mouth, not because of chemical weapons, but because of what they see as an opportunity to make more money. And that's the unfortunate part. I'm frustrated at what I see. Again, what I've seen in terms of the misery that people suffered at the hands of these global military industrial complexes, including Israel's and Russia's, and not so much China's at this point, at least not yet, but certainly the violence that exists in some of these countries is just incredible, and it's frustrating, and it's it also, I mean, it makes it hard to raise issues of other injustices. I mean, as a Native person, as we're fighting a Dakota Access Pipeline, for instance, if they're not killing you, it's like, what do they say? What's the news say? If it bleeds, it leads. So if they're just abusing you, if they're just stealing your land, if they're just destroying the planet, oh, that's okay. If Trump is just obliterating environmental concerns and planning to go into Bears Ears and in the Grand Canyon and so many other places, I mean, to just obliterate the environment, going into offshore and to the Arctic Refuge and all these other places, it's like the world is expected to not pay any attention to this because there's extreme violence that deserves more attention. When I tackle an issue like the mascot issue, and somebody says to me, yeah, but aren't there bigger issues? Yeah, there's bigger issues. There's always bigger issues. But it doesn't mean that you don't address the things that may not seem as urgent or as life-threatening at the moment. But all of this stuff has long-term effects. If all we do is sit around and protest war, but we don't protest, killer cops and the militarization of police forces and the injustices, the social injustices, the racism. No, we've got to address all these issues. So, look, and I'm not suggesting that we don't give attention to the violence in the world. But off the advice of my friend Degarundage, who said, look, we as indigenous people, we as a people, we've got to pick and choose the battles that we're going to fight. We got to pick the battles that we can that not just that we can win, but that we can engage. There's almost nothing that I can do to stop a moron in Washington from dropping bombs on Syria, or a moron, in Moscow from doing it either. There's almost nothing that I can do. And you know what? I don't feel any affinity towards the whole enemy of my enemy is my friend. No, I don't buy any of that crap. Russia is as guilty of atrocities as the United States claims they are. But you know what? The United States is every bit as guilty of the atrocities that Russia claims they are. I mean, in case people forget, the most deadly and heinous weapon aren't these nerve agents? It probably isn't even the biological warfare that has been waged. It's been nuclear weapons, and the United States dropped 2 of them, and they dropped them on civilians. So when everybody's getting all self-righteous and truth, justice, in the American way, I think people have to take a little bit of a truth pill here and realize that there is no one that has earned the right that is currently at the table to assert the moral authority over another country. Now, I'm not saying that we don't all have a responsibility and that there shouldn't be an effort to seek some sort of balance in world peace. There should be. But you know what? I've got to take a stronger look at what's immediately around me. And I know that I've got to look at the things that we need to do close to home, with our family, with our community, with our region. And I don't mean just a native thing. I mean, yeah, I'm concerned about our territories and asserting our sovereignty and defending ourselves against New York State. But you know what? The Senecas who stepped up to stop this wastewater, this fracking wastewater from being dumped in Coudersport, couldn't have done it without the non-native allies who stood alongside them. And why did the non-native allies stand alongside them? It wasn't just to stand with the Senecas. It affects them too. There were good people in Coudersport. There were good people in Pennsylvania who were against this thing. And when truth was told, became more and more adamant against it. It's important that we find the common ground, and we use that common ground, because it's not just about trying to be righteous or trying to be right. It's about what do you do? What do you do at the local level? People always talk about the global economy, and I always say, well, what about the local economy? And by economy, I don't mean just dollars and cents. I don't just mean financial transactions. Look, there's a lot of challenges that we're being faced with, and we're inundated with all kinds of BS on the news, on the internet, on Facebook. And look, and I don't condemn Facebook. I know it's easier to jump all over, these companies that make lots of money off of us. But we have to apply the critical thinking that is necessary to digest the unbelievable amount of information, much of it false, that runs through us, runs by us, and runs in front of our eyes, in front of our fingertips. We can become obsessed with conspiracy theories. I'm saying, make sure that you're not a part of one. Make sure that you're not being a tool of somebody's grand conspiracy. That's the biggest thing you can do to stop conspiracies, is not be a part of one. And, and of course, it's easy to say, just don't spread rumors and gossip. No, I'm saying try to evaluate the information that's coming to you. And before you share it with somebody else and you say, oh, you know what such and such did, make sure that such and such really did that. Whether it's, whether it's your next door neighbor or the president of the United States. I have no love for New York State or the United States in terms of their governmental function, in terms of the processes and or the intent of either party within those systems. Obviously it's a Democrat in the governor's spot for New York State, and I have some serious problems with the racist comments and the condescending attitude that he and his lieutenant governor have towards Senecas and towards Native people in general. I have a big problem with that, but I also have a big problem with the racist moron that's in the White House right now. And what happens is we invariably are encouraged to take a side, right versus left, FBI versus the White House. The FBI is no innocent and isn't innocent in all this stuff. It's like this crazy game that we're being sucked into to have an emotional response. White people are protecting white people. And I say this all the time. I recently, when I saw some of the leaders from those areas that Trump is trying to take out of national monument status, they said, "Well, we're ready for a fight. If Trump wants a fight, we're going to give him a fight." And then they wanted to talk about how they were going to do legal action, and I couldn't help but chuckle at that. I said, "You want to fight him in court? You know what fighting Trump in court means? It means your hired white people fight their hired white people, and the people who win are white people." I'm sorry. If that sounds racist, that just is what it is. Because we will always be the loser in that. At some point, we need to start doing the things locally that's going to affect the change that we need to affect our family and our community. So, having said all that stuff, I wanted to bring the potential for global violence back home and say, look, we can't stop a president from dropping bombs on a country half a globe away, but we can stand up to him as he's trying to affect our lives in our own homes, in our own territories. So that's my message. Good luck to the Seneca Nation in their suit against the Thruway. We will have more on this, but you know what? Let's use what you said you're going to use. Use the UN Declaration and cite it as often as possible, because it has no power unless we give it power. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. We'll see you on Monday.
I was trying to cross the border to the good old USA. Man said, where you come from, boy? How long you gonna stay? I said, I'm from the Six Nations in the Reserve, don't know when I'm coming back. He said, I'll have to see your Indian cop. I said, why don't you tell me, Jack? Where's your white man's car? Prove to me that you ain't black. Where's your white man's car? Yes, sir, please get off my back. I don't have